I want to end our discussion of information ecosystems where we begin by thinking about effective epistemic agency. Now, this isn't in the chapter itself. I just want to think about and reflect on the sorts of lessons that we've learned from our practical application, our translation of Descartes' abstract thinking about epistemology to this very concrete and contemporary case. So when we think about Descartes' meditations, remember I said that Descartes sort of spells out a dilemma, that effective epistemic agents have to be able to do at least these two things. Right? They have to be able to identify sources of information, and they have to determine the calibration. That is, what sort of information can they get from these sources and how reliable are those sources, maybe even what kind of integrity do those sources have. Now, we might also add to this a worldview, because Descartes was really talking about doing all this in service of developing a knowledge edifice, a comprehensive knowledge about the nature of the world, the self, society, and so on. So it looks like he also was thinking about a worldview. And to be an effective epistemic agent, you have to have sources of information that you, or sources that you have some sense of calibration for, and you use that information together with your worldview, the beliefs that you already have about how the world works and how to understand the things that are coming to you through these channels of information. So I think we see that all of this is really part of our thinking about information ecosystems and the epistemology of our everyday life. But I think there's more that we can think about. There are additional elements of effective epistemic agency that emerge as we start to think about information ecosystems, as we start to apply these abstract thoughts to our concrete world situation. And the first thing I think that we'll know, right, is information ecosystems themselves. So effective epistemic agents need to cultivate and utilize epistemic infrastructure, right? They need to cultivate tools. They need to cultivate sources. They need to cultivate networks. And this is part of what an effective epistemic agent really needs. They need to be able to rely on these artifacts, these individuals, these networks. I think you also have to cultivate habits. So one important habit, I think, is to cultivate a disposition to fact check things that seem unusual or that you've never heard of before. Cultivate the habit of informing yourself about things just in your spare time. Cultivate the habit of maintaining and refining your information ecosystem. All of these things, habits about how you approach your intellectual and epistemic life, these are important things that lay the groundwork for effective epistemic agency. And likewise, we saw the development and refinement of our information ecosystem. It requires us to develop skills at research, skills at learning, skills at making inferences and decisions using that information. Effective epistemic agents have skills that help them utilize their information, that help them deploy their worldview in effective ways. And finally, I think we saw when we looked at confirmation bias and belief perseverance and the backfire effect, as well as when we looked at the notion of integrity being paired with reliability to create accuracy in our information ecosystems, that value is important too. What we think is important. And if we think that believing the truth is important, if we think that having our beliefs be well evinced is important, if we think that making decisions based on good information is important, these values also prepare us to be more effective epistemic agents. And when we don't have these values, we fall into things akin to yellow journalism. So I think now we have an even more detailed notion about what effective epistemic agency really involves. It involves the identification and cultivation of sources of information. It involves determining their calibration. It involves creating a worldview, a set of beliefs that facilitates your adaptive interaction with the world, given the information that you have. It involves cultivating and creating epistemic infrastructures, whether they're telescopes or microscopes, whether they are computers, so on, things that help facilitate the flow of information, the ability to make inferences and decisions, the ability to share that information or decisions with other people, and so on. And we also have to cultivate habits. And you can differentiate habits from skills, and then here's a nice example, actually. So if I want to know where my keys are, one way I could do that is to constantly remember exactly where I put them. The other is to cultivate a habit of putting them in the same place every day. And in my own experience, I've found that people who do this, they tend to lose things much less often. If they just have the habit of hanging their key up on a hook or putting their key in a bowl by their door or so on, right? So cultivating habits, just dispositions to behave in certain ways that aren't reflective or particularly skillful, but nevertheless epistemically useful, as well as skills like the ability to research things that you don't necessarily have any information about prior to, or sources that you have specifically for prior to, and then this value, this commitment. And so all the infrastructure, all the habits, all the skills, even the worldview aren't going to help you if you're not really interested in making decisions that are optimal and based on fact, in coming to believe things that are true or at least highly evinced and not poorly evinced or likely false. So I think by reflecting on this practical case, we learn a little bit more about effective epistemic agency than even we learned in reading through Descartes' Meditations. So next week we're going to turn our ship of philosophical state, and we're going to look at another topic. The topic that we're going to look at now is the philosophy of religion. So the rational evaluation of belief in the supernatural and specifically in deities.